I built a company from nothing and let my own son-in-law run it without ever knowing it was mine. For years, I stayed silent, watching, trusting, believing that the family would always choose integrity. I was wrong. The night he sat across from me and chose silence over truth was the moment everything broke. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that changes how you see someone forever. And what came after wasn't just a betrayal. It was a test of who we really are when loyalty and truth collide. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're tuning in from. We love seeing how our stories connect people from all around the world. Your comments and thoughts bring this community to life, and we're so grateful to have you on this journey with us. If you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now, grab a cozy seat, maybe a cup of coffee or tea, and prepare yourself for a tale that will captivate your heart from beginning to end. Let's begin. My name is Margaret Hayes. I am 67 years old, and for the past decade, I have lived in a small town in Vermont where the mornings arrive quietly and the world moves at a pace that most people have forgotten. The air here carries the scent of pine and old paper, especially inside my bookstore, which sits on the corner of Maple Street. To anyone who walks through its narrow aisles, I am simply the woman who recommends novels, remembers birthdays, and closes early when the light fades too quickly in winter. It is a life I chose carefully. People assume simplicity means a lack of history. They see the worn wooden shelves, the handwritten price tags, and the absence of ambition. They do not ask questions, and I do not offer answers. In a place like this, anonymity is not something you earn. It is something you protect. What they do not know is that long before I learned how to catalog secondhand books, I built something far more complex. I founded Helixara Biotech nearly 20 years ago, in a time when I had more determination than resources and more risk than certainty. Back then, I worked out of a rented lab with borrowed equipment and a belief that medical innovation should not belong only to those who could afford to control it. The company grew faster than I expected. What began as a fragile idea became a force in its field, expanding into research, production, and global partnerships. Investors came, boards formed, and eventually I stepped away. Publicly, it looked like retirement. Quietly, it was something else entirely. Through a trust designed with precision and patience, I retained 55% of the company's controlling shares. Not visible, not discussed, but absolute. Control without presence. Influence without attention. That was the design. My daughter Emily has never known that version of me. To her, I am simply her mother, a woman who reads too much and asks too many questions. She chose a different path, becoming a pediatric doctor, dedicating her life to children and families in ways I deeply respect. She believes I left my past behind. I never corrected her. Daniel, her husband, believes something else entirely. He is the current chief executive officer of Helixara Biotech. Intelligent, disciplined, and ambitious, he carries himself like a man who earned everything he has. In many ways, he did. I supported his rise, quietly ensuring he had the opportunities he needed to prove himself. I watched him lead, make decisions, and shape the company I once built. He has never questioned where real authority lies. I have spent years observing him, not as an executive, but as a mother. I have seen how confidence can evolve into certainty, and how certainty can blur into something more dangerous. Power rarely announces its effects. It reveals them slowly in small choices that most people overlook. That is why I remained silent. Not out of fear, but out of understanding. Silence, when used correctly, is not weakness. It is a form of control. It allows you to see clearly while others assume you are not watching at all. For a long time, that silence protected everything that mattered to me. My family remained intact. My company remained strong. My role remained hidden. But recently, something has shifted. It is not loud or obvious. It never is. It is a feeling, a pattern just slightly out of place, a change in tone that most people would ignore. I have learned not to ignore such things, because after all these years, I can sense it. The life I built in silence is about to be tested. If you're still watching and already sensing there's more beneath the surface, comment number 1 below to let me know you're with me. Now, let's move on to what started to change everything. The restaurant overlooked the harbor, its tall windows reflecting a skyline softened by evening light. Boston always carried a certain restraint, a quiet confidence that reminded me of people who never needed to prove themselves. It was an appropriate place to celebrate Helixera's latest milestone, though celebration was not the word I would have chosen for what that night became. Daniel had arranged everything. The table was set with deliberate precision, the kind that suggested control rather than comfort. He spoke easily with the staff, acknowledged colleagues who passed by, and carried himself with the assurance of a man fully settled into his position. Across from him, Emily listened with a gentle smile, her attention warm and genuine, untouched by the undercurrents I had already begun to notice. Richard sat beside Daniel, quieter than usual. That alone was enough to hold my attention. Men like Richard Brooks do not fade into the background without reason. Silence, in his case, was never absence. It was preparation. I watched the way he observed the room, the subtle timing of his movements, the patience in his posture. He was waiting for something, or perhaps for the right moment to begin. Dinner progressed without incident at first. Conversations moved between company performance, future expansion, and Emily's work at the hospital. On the surface, everything appeared composed. Beneath it, something felt deliberately restrained, as if the evening had been structured toward a purpose only one person fully understood. Halfway through the meal, Richard reached into his briefcase. He did not rush. He never did. He placed a thick envelope on the table and slid it toward me with a measured calm. The paper was heavier than necessary, cream-colored, formal in a way that felt intentional. It was not meant to be ignored. "You should review this," he said quietly. There was no urgency in his voice. That was what made it dangerous. I opened the envelope without hesitation. Inside was a legal document, structured with precision, written in language designed to appear indisputable. It accused me of misappropriating biomedical research data from 2 decades ago, an allegation severe enough to dismantle a reputation carefully built over a lifetime. I read every line once, then again, not because I needed to understand it, but because I needed to confirm what I already knew. This was not an accusation. It was a construction. I lifted my eyes slowly. Daniel had not touched his glass. He was not looking at me. "It would be better to handle this privately," he said. The words were controlled, almost rehearsed. There was no accusation in his tone, but there was no defense either. That absence spoke more clearly than anything else he could have said. Emily glanced between us, confusion beginning to replace her earlier ease. She did not yet understand what was happening, but she could feel the shift. Families always sense it before they comprehend it. I folded the document carefully and placed it back into the envelope. Earlier that afternoon, Caroline had sent me a report. Small irregularities, financial traces connected to entities I recognized immediately. At the time, they had been incomplete. Now, sitting at that table, they formed a pattern that was no longer subtle. This had been planned, not recently, but over time, with patience and intention. I felt no anger, not yet. What I felt was recognition. Richard believed he was presenting leverage. Daniel believed he was protecting something larger than the moment. Neither of them understood the full structure they were attempting to control. I placed my hands on the table, steady and calm. There was nothing to argue, nothing to deny, because the truth did not need to be spoken yet. It only needed time. As the conversation resumed around me, thinner now, more fragile, I understood something with absolute clarity. The next 48 hours would not be about accusations. They would be about revelation, and I had already decided I would let them proceed. If that moment at the table made you feel something wasn't right, comment number 2 below so I know you're paying attention. Now, let's see how things began to unravel. I returned to Vermont the morning after the dinner, the quiet roads and familiar landscape offering a kind of stillness that most people would have found comforting. For me, it only sharpened the contrast. The world I had chosen to live in was calm, predictable, grounded. The world I had built was none of those things, and it was already beginning to move without me. The envelope remained in my bag, untouched. I did not need to read it again. What mattered was not the accusation itself, but the intention behind it. Richard had not acted impulsively. That much was clear. His confidence at the table had not come from assumption. It had come from preparation. What unsettled me more was Daniel. Not what he said, but what he did not. Hesitation reveals more than denial ever could. I had spent years watching him lead, measuring his decisions against pressure, observing how he carried authority. That night, for the first time, I saw uncertainty, not weakness, but conflict. And conflict, when guided by the wrong influence, can be reshaped into compliance. By midday, the first call came from Caroline. Her voice was steady, but there was a precision in her words that told me the situation had already progressed beyond containment. An emergency board session had been scheduled. Richard was pushing for a formal internal investigation, framing it as a necessary step to protect the company's integrity. He was setting the stage. 2 board members had already expressed concern. That meant he had spoken to them in advance. The narrative was being constructed carefully, piece by piece, before any official discussion had even begun. I stood by the window of my bookstore as she spoke, watching the slow movement of clouds gathering over the hills. Vermont weather rarely announces itself loudly. It changes gradually, almost politely, until suddenly it is something else entirely. This is no longer internal, Caroline added. Information is starting to circulate. That did not surprise me. Anonymous sources, early inquiries from industry reporters, subtle shifts in investor communication. It was always the same pattern. You introduce doubt quietly, then allow it to grow until it no longer needs your guidance. After the call, she sent me the data. The document from the envelope had been created months ago. It had been revised multiple times, each version routed through a consulting firm that existed more on paper than in practice. The structure was deliberate, designed to appear independent while remaining controlled. This was not a reaction. It was a campaign. Later that afternoon, another message arrived. Short, precise, impossible to ignore. A digital authorization had been executed under Daniel's credentials. The timing aligned with the internal movements Caroline had flagged weeks earlier. The routing traced back to a network associated with Richard's financial interests. The signature was valid, but the context was wrong. I closed my eyes briefly, not in frustration, but in recognition. Daniel had not done this. He had been used. That realization shifted something within me. Until that moment, I had remained an observer, allowing events to unfold as they would. But observation has its limits. There comes a point where inaction becomes its own form of decision. And yet, I did not intervene. Not because I lacked the means, but because the truth was not fully visible yet. If I stepped in too soon, I would interrupt the very pattern that needed to reveal itself completely. There were still pieces missing. The board meeting was set for 48 hours from now. That was the window Richard believed he controlled. Enough time to shape perception, not enough time for resistance to organize. He was counting on pressure to force alignment. He did not understand patience. As the afternoon faded into evening, the sky darkened just enough to confirm what I already sensed. The storm was not coming suddenly. It was building layer by layer, intention by intention. This was no longer about an accusation. It was about control. And control, once challenged, never returns quietly. If you can feel the pressure building and you're wondering who's really in control, comment number 3 below to stay with me. Now, let's move into where the cracks start to widen. The second day began without urgency, but not without weight. In Vermont, the morning light settled gently across the bookstore windows, illuminating rows of aging paperbacks and quiet corners that had not changed in years. It was a kind of stillness most people long for. For me, it had become something else entirely. A place to think, to observe, and when necessary, to wait. Waiting, however, does not mean absence. Caroline's updates arrived with increasing frequency, each one carrying more structure than the last. Richard had moved beyond suggestion. He was now framing the situation as a matter of corporate responsibility, positioning himself as the voice of stability within uncertainty. It was a familiar strategy. Control the narrative early, and the outcome begins to follow. 2 more board members had shifted in his direction. That told me everything I needed to know. Influence had already been applied before the official discussion. By the time the meeting convened, most decisions would not be made in that room. They would simply be confirmed there. Outside the corporate sphere, the pressure was beginning to expand. Media inquiries were no longer tentative. They had sharpened, moving from general questions to targeted requests for confirmation. Internally, communication within Helixara had grown more cautious. Language becomes careful when people sense instability, even if they cannot yet define it. Daniel was at the center of it. Caroline described him as composed in public, but increasingly withdrawn in private. He was attempting to contain the situation, to keep it within boundaries he could still manage. That instinct was understandable. Control, once threatened, often leads to tighter restraint rather than confrontation. But restraint under the wrong conditions becomes avoidance. He had not reached out to me. That, more than anything, revealed where he stood, not fully aligned with Richard, but not yet willing to challenge him either. It was the most dangerous position a leader could occupy, uncertain, but responsible for certainty. Emily sensed it. She called me that afternoon, her voice carrying a hesitation she tried to hide. She spoke about small things at first, the hospital, her schedule, the weather shifting earlier than expected. Beneath it, there was something else, concern, unformed but present. She did not yet know the details, but she understood enough to feel that something was wrong. I listened more than I spoke. There are moments when explanation only complicates what the heart already recognizes. She would see the truth soon enough. It was not something I could shield her from, no matter how much I might want to. Later, Caroline sent another file. The document from the envelope had not only been revised multiple times, it had been adjusted with precision. Each change aligned with key internal events, creating a timeline that appeared natural, but was anything but. It was not simply fabricated. It was engineered to withstand scrutiny. Richard was not just accusing me. He was constructing a situation in which Daniel would have no choice but to stand beside him. That was the true design. Not exposure, but alignment. I set the tablet down and walked toward the window, watching the sky as it shifted into a deeper gray. The air had grown heavier, carrying the quiet signal of a coming storm. In Vermont, weather changes rarely announce themselves loudly. They gather, slowly and deliberately, until resistance no longer matters. This was no different. I could intervene now. I had the authority, the evidence, and the position to disrupt everything Richard was building. But timing, in matters like this, is not about action. It is about clarity. If I moved too soon, I would force a conclusion. If I waited, the truth would define itself. And truth, when it emerges on its own, cannot be undone. So I chose to remain where I was, not passive, not uncertain, but deliberate. Because what was unfolding was no longer just about a company. It was about revealing who each of us truly was when pressure left no room for pretense. If you're starting to see the bigger picture and it's making you question everything, comment number 4 below so I know you're still here. Now, let's get to the moment where truth begins to surface. By the time the final 24 hours began, I no longer felt the need to remain at a distance. Waiting had served its purpose. The pattern was complete, the intention fully visible. What remained now was not observation, but action. I left Vermont before sunrise. The drive was quiet, the kind that allows thought to settle into clarity. I did not rehearse what I would say. There was no need. Truth, when it is fully understood, does not require preparation. It only requires timing. When I arrived in Boston, Helixara's headquarters stood exactly as I remembered, precise, composed, and carefully controlled. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside, everything had. I entered without drawing attention. There are advantages to being forgotten. From the mezzanine level, I looked down onto the executive floor. Daniel stood near the center, speaking with 2 senior analysts. His posture was steady, his voice measured, but there was a subtle tension in the way he held himself, not visible to most, but unmistakable to me. Pressure had found him. Caroline met me moments later, her expression composed but direct. She did not waste time with pleasantries. The forensic audit was complete. Every trace, every revision, every digital signature pointed in one direction. The document had been constructed through a network tied to Richard's financial control. It was no longer suggestion, it was structure. The board was preparing for the morning session. Media presence had been quietly confirmed. Richard intended to make the accusation public. He believed the narrative was already his. I asked to speak with Daniel. The conference room was empty when I entered. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the harbor, the gray water reflecting a sky that had yet to decide whether it would clear or darken further. It felt appropriate. Daniel arrived within minutes. He closed the door behind him and remained standing for a moment, as if unsure whether to approach or maintain distance. When he finally spoke, his voice carried restraint, but not certainty. I need to understand what is happening. I met his gaze without hesitation. You already do, I said quietly. He exhaled, the control he had maintained beginning to fracture at the edges. He moved to the table and placed a folder in front of me. Inside were copies of the same documents I had already seen, along with internal reports and authorization logs. My signature is on this, he said. I did not approve it. The words were steady, but the weight behind them was unmistakable. I know, I replied. He looked up sharply, searching my expression for doubt, for hesitation, for anything that might confirm or contradict what he was beginning to realize. I did not take anything, I continued, and you did not authorize this. Silence settled between us, not empty, but dense with recognition. I slid my phone across the table. The screen displayed the audit summary Caroline had sent earlier: metadata, timestamps, routing paths, each detail aligned with a single origin point. Not assumption, not interpretation, fact. Daniel read it once, then again. "This is not possible," he said, though the certainty in his voice had already begun to dissolve. "It is," I answered. He leaned back slightly, one hand pressed against the edge of the table, as if grounding himself in something stable. The shift in him was subtle but undeniable. Doubt had turned inward. The question was no longer whether the documents were real, but who had made them so. "My father," he began, then stopped. I did not interrupt. Understanding cannot be forced. It has to arrive on its own. The door opened quietly, and Caroline stepped inside, placing a tablet on the table. Additional records appeared, reinforcing what was already clear: financial transfers, internal communications, a pattern too consistent to dismiss. Daniel stared at the screen, the last layer of uncertainty giving way to something deeper: betrayal. When he finally looked up, the question in his eyes was no longer about the past. It was about what came next. "What do we do now?" I held his gaze, calm and certain. "We let the truth arrive where it cannot be ignored." Daniel did not speak immediately after my answer. The room remained still, the kind of stillness that follows a truth too large to process all at once. I watched him carefully, not as a strategist assessing a variable, but as a mother trying to understand the man her daughter had chosen. There is a difference between shock and awakening. Shock is temporary. Awakening changes everything. He moved slowly, as though the space around him had shifted. The confidence he carried earlier had not disappeared, but it had fractured, revealing something more honest beneath it. Doubt, yes, but also clarity beginning to form in its place. "My father would never," he started, then stopped himself. The sentence could not complete itself because he no longer believed it. I said nothing. This was not a moment that needed guidance. It needed recognition. Daniel turned away from the table and walked toward the window, his reflection faint against the glass. Outside, the harbor remained gray, unmoved by what was unfolding inside. Leadership often feels like that, isolated, removed from the comfort of certainty. "I built everything on trust," he said quietly. "If that is not real, then what is left?" "Truth," I replied. He nodded slightly, though the weight of that word had not fully settled yet. Trust can be inherited. Truth must be chosen. The door opened again, and this time Emily stepped inside. She looked between us, her expression already tense, as if she had sensed the shift before understanding it. There are moments when families change without warning, and this was one of them. She moved closer to Daniel, her voice softer than usual, but edged with something unfamiliar. "What is going on?" Daniel did not answer her immediately. He looked at her, then at me, as if trying to reconcile two versions of reality that no longer aligned. Caroline entered behind her, placing additional documents on the table with quiet efficiency. The evidence was no longer fragmented. It was complete. Emily stepped closer, scanning the files, her confusion deepening into something sharper. Her eyes paused on a section, then moved back, reading it again more carefully. I saw the exact moment it reached her. "I signed something like this," she said, barely above a whisper. Daniel turned toward her, his expression tightening. "When?" he asked. "A few months ago," she said. "Research documentation. I did not think." Her voice faded, replaced by realization. The room seemed to narrow around us. The pattern I had been watching for days was now fully visible to all of us. Not just manipulation, but design. Each step placed carefully, each decision guided without awareness. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, then straightened. That was the moment. Not when he understood what had happened, but when he understood what it required of him. If I stay silent, he said more to himself than to us, then I am part of it. No one answered, because there was nothing to add. He reached for the folder, then for the tablet, then finally for the small black drive Caroline had placed beside them. One by one, he gathered the pieces, not hurriedly, but with intention. I will present everything, he said. The words were steady now, not defensive, not uncertain, decided. Emily looked at him, fear and relief intertwined in her expression. She understood what this meant, not just for the company, but for the family she had built around him. I watched him in silence, recognizing the shift I had been waiting for. He was no longer standing as a son. He was standing as a leader. Outside, the sky darkened further, the first low sound of distant thunder rolling across the harbor. The storm had not arrived yet, but it was no longer something we could avoid. And for the first time, Daniel was ready to face it. If that decision changed the way you see everything, comment number 6 below to let me know you're still with me. Now, let's move on to Chapter 7, where everything comes to light. The morning of the board meeting arrived with a quiet precision that felt almost deliberate. Boston carried a muted gray sky, the kind that softened the edges of buildings and made the harbor look deeper than it was. By the time I entered Helixara's headquarters, the tension was already visible. Security stood near the entrance, not aggressive, but unmistakably present. Beyond them, a line of journalists waited behind a controlled barrier, their attention fixed on the doors as if expecting something more than a routine corporate session. They would not be disappointed. Inside, everything was quieter. Controlled environments often are. Caroline met me near the elevators. Her posture was steady, her voice calm. Everything was ready. The board was assembled. Daniel was already inside. Richard had begun speaking. Nodded and followed her without hesitation. The boardroom was exactly as I remembered, wide, structured, and designed to reflect authority rather than comfort. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the harbor, though no one in the room was paying attention to the view. All focus had settled on the man standing at the head of the table. Richard Brooks. He spoke with measured confidence, each word placed carefully, supported by charts, documents, and a narrative built to appear reasonable. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Authority, when performed correctly, does not rely on volume. He was presenting the accusation: a historical misappropriation of research data, a risk to the company's integrity, a necessary inquiry to protect shareholder interests. Every phrase was constructed to sound responsible, even reluctant. I entered quietly, taking a seat without interruption. Several board members glanced in my direction, their expressions shifting subtly as recognition set in. Not of who I was, but of why I was there. Presence alone can alter a room, even when its meaning is not fully understood. Daniel sat to Richard's right. He did not speak. He listened, his posture composed, his expression unreadable. To anyone else, he might have appeared neutral. To me, he looked like a man measuring something that could not be undone. When Richard finished, a brief silence followed, the kind that invites conclusion. Instead, Daniel stood. He did not rush. He did not hesitate. He simply moved with intention, placing a small device into the presentation system. The screen shifted, replacing Richard's carefully arranged narrative with something far less controlled. Data. Raw, structured, undeniable. Timestamps appeared first, followed by routing paths, then financial records, each layer connected to the next, forming a pattern that did not require interpretation. It only required acknowledgement. Caroline stepped forward, her voice precise, explaining the forensic validation behind the information. She did not dramatize it. She did not need to. The evidence spoke with a clarity that removed any need for emphasis. The room changed. It was not immediate, but it was unmistakable. Attention shifted, postures adjusted. The certainty that had supported Richard's position began to fracture. "This is inaccurate," Richard said, his voice sharper now. Daniel turned toward him. "It is not," he replied. The exchange was brief, but its impact was not. This was no longer a discussion of possibility. It was a confrontation with fact. Board members began asking questions, not of me, but of him. The direction of scrutiny had reversed. Control, once assumed, had slipped beyond his reach. I remained silent. There are moments when speaking too soon diminishes the weight of what is already unfolding. This was not my moment yet. It belonged to the truth. When the chairman finally turned toward me, the room settled once more. Not calm, but expectant. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, "would you like to respond?" I rose slowly, aware of every eye now fixed in my direction. This was the moment everything would change, and I had no intention of wasting it. I stood as the chairman addressed me, aware that the room had shifted in ways no one fully understood yet. The silence was no longer uncertain. It was expectant, waiting for something that would define everything that followed. I did not begin with defense. There was nothing to defend. "I founded Helixara Biotech," I said, my voice steady, carrying across the table without effort. "Nearly 20 years ago." The words settled slowly, as though the room itself needed time to adjust to them. Several directors exchanged glances. Others remained still, processing what they had just heard. Recognition did not come immediately, but it came. "I stepped away publicly," I continued, "but I did not relinquish control. Through a private trust, I retained 55% of the company's voting shares." Caroline moved forward, placing a folder before the chairman. Inside were certified documents, legal confirmations, and shareholder records prepared long before this moment was ever necessary. She explained them with quiet precision, referencing the law firm that had structured the trust, the validation process, and the continuity of ownership. The room changed again, not abruptly, but decisively. Authority, once uncertain, had found its place. Richard remained seated, but the confidence that had defined him earlier had fractured. His expression tightened, disbelief giving way to something sharper. "That is not relevant," he said. "It is," I replied. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. "Your investment was protected," I continued. "It was never intended to grant you control over governance, nor the authority to fabricate evidence." The chairman reviewed the documents briefly before looking up. "This meeting will proceed under that understanding," he said. That was the moment the balance shifted completely. Richard stood then, his composure strained but not yet broken. "You are dismissing years of loyalty," he said, his voice controlled but edged. Daniel rose beside him. "This is not about loyalty," he said. "It is about integrity." The words carried a weight that extended beyond the room. For the first time, there was no hesitation in him, no conflict. Only clarity. Richard turned toward him, searching for something that was no longer there. You would stand against your own family, he said. Daniel did not look away. I am standing for the truth. Silence followed, heavier than before. The chairman called for a vote. One by one, the directors responded. The process was formal, measured, but its outcome was never in doubt. When the final decision was announced, it carried the finality of something that could not be undone. Richard Brooks was suspended from all advisory roles, pending further investigation. Security entered quietly. There was no confrontation, no resistance. Richard gathered his belongings with deliberate care, his movements controlled, though the certainty that once guided them had disappeared. Before leaving, he met my gaze briefly. There was no anger in his expression now, only recognition. When the door closed behind him, the room remained still. The chairman turned to me once more. Mrs. Hayes, would you like to reassume the role of Chief Executive Officer? I considered the question for a moment, then shook my head. No, I said. This company does not need its founder. I looked toward Daniel. It needs a leader. He held my gaze, understanding what I was offering and what it required. I will continue as Chief Executive Officer, he said, his voice steady, with full transparency. The chairman nodded. As the meeting adjourned, the tension that had filled the room began to dissolve, replaced by something quieter, not relief, clarity. Outside, the storm had begun to pass, but I knew better than to believe it was over. Truth does not end in a single moment. It continues, long after the room is empty. In the weeks that followed, the intensity of that morning in the boardroom gave way to something quieter, but no less significant. Consequences, I have learned, rarely arrive with the same force as conflict. They settle in gradually, shaping what remains long after the moment itself has passed. The investigation began almost immediately. Federal authorities requested access to financial records, internal communications, and every document tied to the accusation. What had once been speculation was now subject to scrutiny at a level no one could control. The findings were methodical, precise, and in the end, unavoidable. The documents had been fabricated, the authorization had been manipulated, and the financial activity connected to Richard extended further than any of us had initially understood. What began as an internal conflict revealed itself as something larger, involving external transfers and the misuse of sensitive research data. Richard did not fight publicly. Within a matter of weeks, he resigned from all remaining advisory roles. There were no statements, no attempts to reclaim his position, only quiet withdrawal that carried more weight than any denial could have. Reputation, once fractured in that way, does not recover easily. Daniel faced the aftermath differently. He cooperated fully with investigators, opening every channel of communication, allowing every decision to be examined. It was not an easy position, but it was a necessary one. Leadership, I had always believed, is defined not by control, but by accountability when control is lost. Under his direction, Helixara began to stabilize. Governance structures were revised, oversight strengthened, and transparency became more than a promise. It became practice. Investors, cautious at first, began to respond to that consistency. Confidence does not return quickly, but it does return when it is earned. Emily struggled in her own way. The realization that she had been unknowingly involved weighed on her more than she allowed others to see. Guilt has a quiet presence. It does not demand attention, but it changes how a person carries themselves. One evening, she came to Vermont. The air had shifted toward autumn again, the trees beginning to turn, the landscape settling into the kind of calm that only comes after change has already taken place. We sat on the porch as the light faded, neither of us speaking at first. "Do you regret it?" she asked finally. I considered the question carefully. "Truth is never something I regret," I said. "Only the silence that allows it to be hidden." She nodded, her expression thoughtful, not entirely at peace, but no longer uncertain. Daniel joined us later. He carried himself differently now, not heavier, but more aware. The certainty he once relied on had been replaced with something steadier, something earned. He did not speak much, but he did not need to. Respect, when it is genuine, rarely requires explanation. We sat together as the evening settled around us. There was no sense of victory in that moment, only understanding. The storm had passed, but what remained was not what we had before. It was something quieter, something more honest, and for the first time in a long while, that was enough. Months have passed since the morning everything changed, and yet the memory of it no longer feels sharp. Time has a way of softening even the most defining moments, not by erasing them, but by placing them into context. What once felt like a breaking point now feels like a necessary turning. Life in Vermont has returned to its quiet rhythm. The bookstore opens each morning with the same familiar routine. The bell above the door rings softly, the scent of paper and wood settles into the air, and the hours pass without urgency. On the surface, nothing is different. And yet, everything is. Helixara continues to grow. Not with the aggressive ambition it once carried, but with a steadier, more deliberate pace. Daniel leads it now with a clarity he did not have before. He no longer speaks in certainty, but in consideration. Decisions are made with awareness, not assumption. Authority, in him, has become something quieter, but far more real. Emily visits often. There is an ease between us now that did not exist before, not because the past has been forgotten, but because it has been understood. We speak more openly, without the careful distance that once defined our conversations. Trust, I have learned, is not something that returns on its own. It is rebuilt, piece by piece, through honesty. I no longer think about control the way I once did. For years, I believed that holding power quietly was the safest way to protect what mattered. And in many ways, it was. But silence, even when chosen carefully, carries its own risks. It can preserve, but it can also allow things to grow unchecked. What I understand now is simpler. Loyalty without integrity is fragile. Power without accountability is temporary. And truth, no matter how long it waits, will always find its way forward. I sit on the porch as the evening settles across the fields, the light fading slowly into a soft, steady dusk. The world feels balanced in a way it has not for a long time. Not perfect, not untouched, but honest. And at this stage of life, that is what matters most. Because in the end, it is not the power we hold that defines us. It is the truth we choose to stand with. In the end, life has a quiet way of revealing what truly matters, not through noise or sudden victories, but through the steady unfolding of truth over time. What is built on illusion may stand for a while, but only what is grounded in integrity can endure. There comes a moment when silence is no longer protection, but permission, and recognizing that difference is where real strength begins. Growth does not come from holding on to control, but from learning when to let truth take its course, even when it is uncomfortable. Because in the end, it is not power, status, or recognition that defines a life well lived, but the courage to stand with what is right when it matters most. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to share your thoughts below. Your perspective matters, and if you enjoy stories like this, consider subscribing and following along for more.